In the last half century or so, there's been a huge progress in making working lives more manageable for disabled people. So everything is all right now. Or is it? Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
And knowledge is power.
Knowledge. Education.
Learning.
53% of people with disabilities in the workplace have experienced bullying or harassment, according to Scope. So culturally, organisations still have a long way to go.
When I recorded the interview you're about to hear, the Paralympic Games 2024 had just been launched in Paris to great fanfare, a chance to celebrate and be proud of how far we have all come in supporting and valuing the contribution disabled people make to society. But in the same week, we learned that multiple gold medal winning Paralympian Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson, a peer in the UK House of Lords no less, had to drag herself off a London train on her way to the Games because there was nobody available and appropriately trained to help her. This tragic incident has, apart from anything else, uncovered a widespread failure of training in this area. To find out what we still have to learn about disability and access, I talked to somebody who trains people for a living in disability issues and is also disabled himself.
Hack Facts.
Chris J is founder and managing director of Bascule Disability Training, a UK-based social enterprise that empowers workforces with a firmer understanding of all areas of disability through bespoke training modules. A prominent voice on disability inclusion in the UK, he knows of what he speaks. Chris was born with cerebral palsy and has been a wheelchair user for over 25 years. Chris, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome to The Learning Hack.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Chris, can you tell us about Bascule Disability Training, the company you run? What do you do and what are you for? Who are you for, I should say?
Well, we're a social enterprise that offers organisations the opportunity to create truly inclusive business environments and workplace cultures, helping them to understand and access the benefits of disability inclusion. Essentially, we're a disability awareness training provider, but we wanted to Ron-sill it in that sense. We wanted a name that, it does exactly what it says on the tin, but so much of it is more about trying to bring about cultural change in organisations. And we do this through training and consultation. So we look at things like appropriate language, legislation, communication techniques, and how to create inclusive work environments. And we do it for SMEs, large corporates, and education. There's nobody we don't do it for. And as someone with a disability, I do this both for myself and for the 24% of the population that live with a disability. And finally, as a social enterprise, all of our profits go to doing awareness raising workshops for school children in schools.
Right. And where does the name come from, Bascule?
Okay, so that's an interesting one. It's a French word, but it's also a term for a bridge, a kind of Bascule bridge, which is a drawbridge.
Yeah.
Okay, and because one of the stats I'm always quoting is that 67% of the British population feel uncomfortable talking to people with disabilities, the drawbridge is up, and my job is to bring it down so that everybody is communicating. It's also the French term for balance, and of course, reasonable adjustment is a form of balance, and that's something we have enshrined in law.
Interesting. As a brown person, I'm always interested in names. It's also got another rather darker meaning. It was a medieval instrument.
Medieval torture device, yes.
Okay.
That's a joke I save for when training's going really badly.
Okay, I'm sure that's not too often. So how did you come to be doing this? Can you tell us about your own condition? It won't be obvious to people watching on YouTube that you're in a wheelchair, and certainly won't be to podcast listeners. So tell us about your own condition and your experience in the education system with that. Can't have been easy. and how this led to your heading up this company. Sorry, 3 questions in one.
It's a bumper question. Well, as always been said, it's the old joke. I have a face for radio, and that kind of applies to my disability too. I have cerebral palsy, so yes, I'm a wheelchair user. I was born 10 weeks premature, so I was 3 pounds 2.5 ounces when I was born in 1985. So I was a little diddy baby, and as a result of that, I have brain damage in my motor cortex, which affects mostly my legs, but it does affect my arms as well, but to a much less obvious extent to anybody who's kind of not me. In terms of how I got started on this path, I think it goes right the way back to primary school. Now, I'm also a director of a lovely little independent school called Great Ballard School in Chichester. And the reason for that is when my parents were looking to find somewhere to educate me when I was sort of 4 to 5 years old, none of the local schools were interested in the least in dealing with a child who had additional physical needs, who had mobility issues. And the local state schools, looking for polite words here, weren't interested. Several of the local independent schools didn't feel they could cope with my needs. But there was one, Great Ballard School, where the head was prepared to take a risk on me. And as a result on that, I have a lifelong relationship with the school because it was the only one that was prepared to accept me. And although as a sort of 4 to 5 year old, I didn't intuit this, but I do now when I look back. I experienced discrimination from the very start of my life in that sense. And I'm incredibly grateful to Great Ballard for giving me these opportunities that I wouldn't otherwise have had. And then when I moved on to secondary school, I went to a school with a special support unit attached. So that's a regular mainstream school that has an area that is there to support those with additional needs. And bullying and misunderstanding was absolutely rife. So that was a big issue that I came to experience. And then when I went to university, I sort of experienced the same thing with, to be blunt, drunk people who would ask all sorts of inappropriate questions, who'd never dealt with disability before. I remember being stuck in a lift with someone once and then flat out asking me about my sexual function, just because they thought it was a really important question that they had to ask right then and there for some reason. And when I was at university, a very good friend of mine pointed me in the direction of a charity called Enable Me, which sadly is no longer in existence. And it made its living by going into schools and talking to kids about what it was like to have a disability. And it was almost like a religious calling to me. I immediately knew what I wanted to do with my life. So when Enable Me shut down due to lack of funds, that's when I started Bascule Disability Training, taking all the knowledge I'd gained from running the charity and commercializing it while still keeping the work for children free.
Within both of our lifetimes, my lifetime being substantially longer than yours, certainly for me, things have undoubtedly got a bit better within my lifetime as regards attitudes to disability and awareness within organisations, although obviously the type of lift conversation with a drunken student is still going on to this day. And cerebral palsy, for instance, people with cerebral palsy have a higher profile. There's kind of Rosie Jones, the comedian, and so on. Disability is, in a way, is not as invisible as it used to be. There's more legislation and so on. One would hope there's more hope and so on, but probably still a way to go, you're going to tell me. I mean, just this week, for instance, in the week that we're recording it, although we've had the wonderful Paris Paralympics ceremony last night, which was a brilliant thing. Just 2 days ago, Baroness Tanny Gray Thompson in the UK was forced to crawl off a train because the railway station didn't have the facilities to help her off there. And she said crawl off. She tried to explain this to the interviewer that she can't actually crawl. She doesn't have that level of mobility. She had to drag herself off the train because there was no one there to help her. And that that's quite shameful. What are the most common challenges you come up against in your work with organisations? But also, what do things like that tell us about the general progress?
I'm not one to be negative. I try and always look to the positive. As I've said, Bascule also means balance. So I'm always looking to balance the good with the bad. Sadly, I've met the wonderful Dame Tony Gray-Thompson. She's a wonderful human being. I'm also not remotely surprised about her experience. You will also have seen recently, do you see that documentary with Sophie Morgan, I think it was, talking about how terrible planes were and her sort of this campaign she's got going on to improve accessibility on planes. Another good program to watch if anybody's interested in seeing some of the barriers that we face. I quoted earlier that 67% of people feeling uncomfortable about talking to people with disabilities, and I think that's very much borne out from my daily life. We live in a bit of paralysis because everything's supposed to be so politically correct. It's people don't know what to say, and in the end, most of the time, they end up saying nothing, and that's a problem because that only leads to further isolation for people with disabilities. But I mean, 53% of people with disabilities in the workplace have experienced bullying or harassment, according to Scope. So culturally, organisations still have a long way to go. There's also a perception that 1 in 3 people thought that people with disabilities were less productive at work. So again, there's another stereotype that we have to get over. But we also have what I call the psychic problem, okay, which is businesses can't make reasonable adjustments if they don't know reasonable adjustments need to be made. They can't read minds. And we live in this situation where we need people with disabilities to come forward and say what they need without fear of reprisal in order to get the reasonable adjustment that we need. And so it's very much a chicken and egg situation that's going on here. And that's why cultural change training, which is what my work really is so important. And the answer, of course, is in creating attitudes that are open and positive around disability. And the best way to do that is through user-led disability awareness training programs.
Yes, so it's not just about kind of censoring the way that people talk or the language that people use. It's a wider kind of attitudinal thing. Managers will often cite economic reasons for not embracing diversity, even if they'd like to. For a smaller company, for instance, that doesn't have the resources of a large company. It's not always easy to kind of fall in with what they're required to do or what they'd like to do. And accessibility functions are often the first thing to go when budgets get shaved. I mean, my experience of working in digital learning content production companies, for instance, is that accessibility gets shaved off the project when it's kind of not hitting its budget milestones. So it's almost the first thing to go. But on the positive side of that, what's the economic case for maintaining a steady eye on disability? This is your chance to kind of give the other side of that.
Well, for me, there's the carrot and there's the stick. Okay, the carrot is by far my favourite one, which is the value of disabled people and their families is valued at £274 billion a year to UK businesses. And I think most businesses would agree that they'd like to have more business. So the idea of not targeting that group of people either as employees or as customers make no sense whatsoever. And it's been proven that companies with decent EDI strategies in place tend to outperform their competitors financially. Research shows that those organizations are 120% more likely to achieve their financial goals. And 1 in 4 people have a disability. Realistically, can you afford to ignore that part of the population? And on the other side of it, when I was talking about the psychic problem, we live in a world where we want everybody to bring their best selves to work. Now, when I deliver training, I'll often ask a question, which is, does anybody in the room have a disability that they'd be prepared to talk about? And somebody might put their hand up and they might say, oh yeah, I'm dyslexic. And I'll go, thank you for sharing that. Does your boss know? And the response is normally, oh God, no. I was like, well, why not? I was like, well, I can pretty much do my job without it. I can manage. I can, in the words of Churchill, keep buggering on, as it were. But then when I say to them, if you flip that on its head, could you get more work done in a day? Could you be less tired by the end of the day? Could you get that promotion that little bit quicker if rather than fighting your disability, you embrace it and perhaps have something as basic as a screen reader, which in that scenario might help make you more productive?
Yeah. I wanted to talk about the issue of hidden disabilities. I mean, 80% of disabilities are non-visible, you say, and 43% of people are hiding disabilities because they can. I say it's quite easy to do that. I have very poor hearing, for instance. I have hearing aids and a whole load of assistive technologies to help me with that. Teleprompter being one of them that stopped working. And have suffered from depression as well. And with that depression, I went through the excruciating business of having to tell an employer when I got a job after a long period of unemployment that I was going to take a couple of hours off every Wednesday afternoon to go to a therapy session, and that I suffered from this condition. Now, at that point, I fully expected that person, to say, well, look, I'm sorry, we're not going to hire you. And I got headhunted. I was lucky enough. The next couple of jobs, every time I went to a new job, I had to kind of mention the same thing until the course of treatment was, I was sort of flying on my own, as it were. So I'm kind of well aware of that. And the fact that such a large proportion of people are actually hiding disabilities, I think is slightly shocking, as you say. It's more a reflection than a question, I think. Perhaps you can find a question in there to respond to.
Well, I mean, I will share with you what you just shared with me. I suffer from mental health issues. I suffer from anxiety. I suffer from depression. And of course, I've got a really obvious physical disability that you can see. So I have the ability to hide the other one if I so choose. But in reality, there's no point. The whole reason I bang on about cultural change is because we can't prepare businesses in training for every possible scenario they might encounter. There's too many different disabilities. There's too many different syndromes. There's too many different this, that, and t'other. So you have to create this environment where it is okay and encouraged to talk about your needs. Because we've all heard that conversation around the water fountain of, where's Bob? I haven't seen Bob this week. And somebody says, oh, didn't you hear Bob was signed off with stress for 6 months? Oh, I had no idea Bob was suffering. And you get into a situation like that, and it has a huge impact on the rest of the workforce too, because they've then got to try and pick up that other person's work. And we know that having a disability can be very detrimental to physical and mental health and well-being, and it can be dangerous to hide it. That's what people do. But we have some stats that would suggest that employees who reveal their disability are twice as likely to feel more happy and content at work, and that employees that hide their disabilities are often more stressed, anxious, and the risk to physical health is higher as people are less likely to make allowances for their disability. They work when they're unwell. So, for example, in the example you gave, some people might have said, you know what, I can't afford to lose this job. I'm not going to my therapy session. And then you actually don't work on yourself at all, and you just end up trying to carry on through. They use their holidays for hospital appointments. And again, all of these impacts. And the only thing we can do with the hidden disabilities is create an environment and say, where it's okay, come and talk to me about it. We want to put in place reasonable adjustment. And reasonable adjustment doesn't have to be expensive. The average cost of a reasonable adjustment is £75. So it doesn't have to be a lot, and it's proportionate to the size of the business. And if the reasonable adjustment is too expensive for the business, then the business can work with the employee to access to work.
Yeah. I'd just say that there was a corollary to my experience, that because I was upfront about the depression and so on, actually the boss came to me at one point and said, look, we've got this other person who seems to be suffering from depression, although they're not really calling it that. Can you go and talk to them? Unfortunately, I felt I really didn't know what to say, because everybody's sort of experience with that is completely different. So training would have been very helpful in that way. I think we do have to acknowledge that people talk about this more now, and you can kind of sort of an indication of that is that it's become a popular joke, not a very good one. You know, oh dear, I'm having a mental health day, and people, especially younger people, will talk about mental health in general. The other flip side of that is that training in the general area of DEI has had a lot of bad press regarding its effectiveness, and it's politicized. It's part of the woke mind virus that we're supposed to care about other people's disabilities too much. I mean, but actually, the figures on DEI training are pretty bad. It just doesn't seem to work that well. And what that says is it's really hard changing culture. I think everyone who works in the area of kind of organizational change will admit that. Can staff training really create a cultural shift that allows organizations to truly embrace inclusivity? Have you seen positive results in your own work?
100%.
And how have you got those?
Without wanting to beat on the same drum, for me, it's about any training being user-led. You've got to have somebody who's, which is ironic coming from me, walked that particular walk. Otherwise, we have a situation where it's just death by PowerPoint. I do not train in race issues. I do not train in LGBTQ plus issues. I stick to disability because that's where I have real experience. And I think a lot of the problem with DEI now is that we do a lot of it through e-learning. So again, it's a tick box exercise. If you want to bring about meaningful change, you've got to put a real person with disability front and center. And my favorite example is of a client that I worked with. I delivered training to all of their staff. And a couple of days after I delivered the training, 2 members of staff came forward to disclose that they were neurodiverse for the first time. And they felt that they could benefit from a couple of things. They did that because they saw that by bringing me in, the company took disability seriously, and my encouragement to create an open and honest dialogue worked, and they came forward. I think DEI gets a bad name because so much of it is just tick box exercise and not real meaningful work. The other toxic one we have, of course, is the DEI hire, which is the other one. And I just want to remind people that positive discrimination is illegal. Okay, this idea that we're hired just because of our protected characteristic difference is ridiculous. It's always only been about removing the negative aspect that comes with disability or comes with something else. You still have to be the best candidate. It's just about making sure that you can put your best foot forward. And by the same token, if I was in a workplace, and let's make up something ridiculous, let's say I sexually harassed a colleague, okay? I would be out on my backside as quickly as anybody else because I broke the rules. Having a disability doesn't give me a free pass for breaking the rules. The only support I have is in saying I need these reasonable adjustments to do my job effectively. But if I seriously misbehave, I'm still booted out. Okay, so that's really important. This idea that people with disabilities are unfireable is completely ridiculous.
Can you drill a bit deeper into that and talk about your actual training methodologies? Now, you've said there that e-learning can be a bit vanilla in the way it tries to do DEI training. What are the sort of engagements that you've really found most useful in your work, and does digital technology play a part in that, or is it really just all about having the person who walks the walk, talks the talk, and, you know, in the case of Baroness Taddy Grey-Thompson, crawls the crawl, as it were, in front of you in person to make that happen?
I'm afraid to say that since the pandemic, training in person has not really recovered. And that I find that very sad, because for me, there is no substitute to doing it in person, to people seeing the wheelchair, to people knowing that I've got the kind of personality that I'm always happy to answer questions. I tell people in training that I'm scientifically unoffendable, that I've been doing it so long, no one's managed it. And I do a lot of training over Zoom. I'm a big stickler for people keeping their cameras on, because I've done it before where I've worked with a company and I'm training 20 people and they've all had their cameras off. I've now banned that. I said, if cameras aren't on, I don't train. You know, there are exceptions, of course, but I expect the vast majority of cameras to be on because I need to connect with my audience. I need to really talk to them about stuff. I mean, yeah, I could read material like this, like so many other people, and people would fall asleep. So it's also got to be delivered in a way that's as fun as possible, that's as interesting as possible. And you can only really do that through interaction. Now, I am currently working on some e-learning, but it's going to be very video-based. It's going to be based off a lot of my material, and it's going to be as interactive as I can make it. So even when I do Zoom sessions, I make use of breakout rooms. I get them doing group work. It can't be death by PowerPoint because people will just switch off.
I think my experience is that there may be an issue as well about the people who actually create learning content. I've seen a load of kind of DEI training from various companies that I've worked with and for, and you think, well, who is actually creating this stuff? And it's a 25-year-old perfectly healthy who runs marathons at the weekends. And you think, do they really know? You know, does anyone in this design team really have the experience that would make this emotionally compelling and feel real? So I'm kind of with you there.
Yes, you sort of said what I wasn't going to say, which was it's normally put together by some white middle-class young person who probably doesn't have many things stacking the deck against them. And unless you have that degree of understanding, it's very hard to do it. But again, I won't talk about race issues because I don't have that lived experience of racism. I've not experienced that. There might be some aspects of living with a disability that are similar, or perhaps the way I'm treated. I don't know. I'm not in a position to talk about the differences between the two. And I think it's really important when these things are done that they are delivered by someone who can talk about the discrimination they experienced, how it made them feel, but primarily how we can work together to make it better. I mean,
yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Sorry.
Maybe not just delivered by, but written by as well.
Oh,
you know.
Sorry. Yes, when I say delivered by, I made an automatic assumption that it would be written by. But yes, absolutely. Yes. It has to be written and delivered by, because if it's written by and delivered by someone else, then you can't really drill down into the examples. You can't say how it made you feel, and those things that really allow you to connect to other people aren't there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we've taken, since, you know, in my experience of, you know, digital learning gradually taking over more and more of stand-up training, we've come to something that it's sort of like the production of whole cloth training, that it's kind of for everybody and it will fit every organization. There is a kind of specificity in really good training to the sector, the person, the issue, and so on, that perhaps we need to recover, and more sophisticated digital forms of learning perhaps can help us to do that.
Something that's come everything up I do is bespoke. That's the word I use all the time.
A thing that's come up there is we talked about how it's how mental health issues have come more into this discussion, I think, and it is in some senses easier for people to talk about their mental health issues than it used to be. But there's a slightly counterintuitive aspect to the hidden nature of that, especially with mental health disabilities, in that mental health seems to get more attention from management often than visible physical disabilities. I've heard people complain about this. Why is that?
That's a really good question. I think in recent years, the conversation around mental health has become much more prominent, and therefore the stigma around it has reduced. But I think there's an immediate acceptance that mental health issues can happen to anyone at any time. Of course, the reality is disabilities can also happen to anyone at any time, but we've not quite worked our way around that. But in terms of mental health, this has led to workplaces taking a measured approach to it, which has led to improved cultural awareness. And in some ways, it's a little step further on from disability. It's just on that slightly higher rung where it's more embedded into the workplace. And we really should learn from that and apply the same attention, the same recognition and awareness and cultural consciousness towards all disabilities. And that way, a more positive perception towards disability will generally be gained. But again, we can only prepare people for a certain number of scenarios. You need to have this open communication so that whatever permutation of disability, mental health, and whatever else happens, that you can deal with through open communication.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that physical disability can happen at any time. You know, even if you're a kind of executive who just pushes this to the back of the pile, doesn't want to fund it, all the rest of it. Just remember, you're only one bad skiing accident away from being in that box yourself. Handbrake turn of a change of topic here. You also have a showbiz side to your work, I think. You tell us about Bascule Entertainment and what that does. And you get over to Hollywood with this, don't you?
I do, to an extent. I'm doing a lot of free consulting over there at the moment while I build the package up for my visa. But when I started getting involved in the industry, because I'm curious about everything. I'm curious about how everything's put together. And Bascule Entertainment is a film production company where we are going to, when we're ready, create projects that celebrate and support the talents of people with disabilities. And I'm not just talking about actors in front of the camera. I'm talking about the teams behind the camera. I'm talking about writing stories or, making stories from people with disabilities, because so much of what we see on screen tends to star able-bodied actors in roles for people with disabilities. It's not been written by someone with a disability, and I want to give people with disabilities the same chance to sort of make stuff that's really important to them. If someone with a visual impairment has a great idea for an action movie, I want to hear about that too, because why should people with disabilities be pigeonholed into only writing stuff around disability? And it's driven by a bit of a desire, I suppose, to see more people with real disabilities on screen. And I'll just give you a little example of why I want to change things I want to change. For anybody who enjoys the American show NCIS that's now been running for 20 plus years, one of the characters relatively recently got married, and they married someone with a disability, someone who's in a wheelchair. Okay, and they cast an able-bodied actor in that role.
Yeah.
And I really feel like that's kind of unnecessary. In the same way, I want to bring about cultural change to businesses through Bascule Disability Training. I want to bring about the same awareness and change in disabilities in the film industry. So our content is created by a diverse team that embraces the talents of people with lots of different disabilities. And we're also, as a starting point, when I get the visa, because I have to be very careful in case US immigration decides to watch this.
You've got to be very careful of those people, yeah.
Very careful. We're also going to be providing consultancy to existing film organisations about how to make inclusive film sets and how to do things like that. So it's obviously much newer than Bascule Disability Training, but we're really excited about the change that we can bring to the industry.
Yeah, it's an interesting area, isn't it? Because I think there is a kind of back of mind, not very often voiced feeling about this whole area that if that when you get into it and you kind of surface disability issues and you use people with disabilities, make them more visible as writers, actors and so on, the whole thing's going to get a bit worthy. It's going to get a bit grey and boring and worthy. And watching it will be a duty call, not a booty call, so to speak. On the other side of that, you can look at things that have been amazing success in entertainment, like Bridgerton, for instance, which is not colourblind casting, that's the wrong way to put it, but I'm not sure exactly. But it's extremely diverse casting. They recently had somebody in it who was disabled in a wheelchair as a tutor, and it was kind of introduced as normal. I mean, it's incredibly woke, and yet that is an incredibly entertaining, very popular, absolute prime time piece of content. So it kind of can be done.
It can be done, and here's what I'd say on the whole woke issue. For me, it's really important that the story comes first, and the mission or whatever your political feelings are come second. Even in Bascule Entertainment, the first job is to tell entertaining stories that people will enjoy, because otherwise you have, as my friends would call it, a special film for special people, and nobody else is going to see it. So you need to create something, as you say, like Bridgerton, that has that appeal to people more than those with disabilities, and just make disability a more natural part of everything that we do.
Yes, I think if people are, if a content piece like Bridgerton or something becomes massively famous, or if an artist, a person becomes massively famous, somehow we kind of forget about it. We shouldn't forget about it. On the other hand, it should be acknowledged. But nobody kind of really cites James Joyce, Homer, Milton, the poet John Milton, as being examples of disabled people working in the arts, and yet all three of those are blind. Where do people go to if they want to find out more about disability issues and learning? What are the best sources finding out more about that? If you're in a working place, you have a training remit, a learning remit.
Well, the place where I get inspiration really is my colleagues in the industry. A lot of my friends with disabilities, I will go to them and I will say, what's your current big button topic? What's currently really pissing you off? That's how I go and get information and inspiration from that. And I use that to create a huge library of blogs and articles and resources that you can find at bascule.com. So we have a lot of material there that's completely free in terms of blogs and everything else, where we go into various topics, and anything good that we find, any other articles and stuff, we post there as well. So I'd like to think our website is a good place that people can go. We're always happy to answer questions if people have them, and we really want to support them in terms of bringing a change in disability culture into their workplace.
That's sources. Are there any particular people you want to highlight who you find inspiring, who always talk sense?
Always talk sense. Tanny Gray.
None of us always talk sense, but
Tanny Gray is a great example.
Yeah.
A lot of the Paralympians do talk a lot of sense because they've walked the walk. They've overcome a disability to the point where they're then performing at a high level. So for me, it's really colleagues and friends that I go to because they live in that situation.
Personally, I found this a very inspiring interview to hear, and I feel as if I've learned a lot as well from doing it. So thank you very much, Chris, for giving us your time today.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to our sponsors. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
The Learning Hack is among the top 5% of shows most listened to globally, according to Listen Notes. And if you think your organisation could benefit from sponsoring the Learning Hack, or from using our knowledge and resources to start your own learning podcast, you can contact me on john@learninghackpodcasts.com. Until next time.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.